Good morning. Thank you for having me here. My name is Mark Green, and I'm one of the co-lead ministers at Broadview United, and my pronouns are he, him. I bring greetings from Broadview, your sister congregation, and we are delighted to be welcoming you as a part of these affirming congregations as we work together to build a world where inclusion is second nature. We're not there yet, but nonetheless, I'm delighted to be here. Over my 18 years in Victoria, there have been lots of times in which I've been in this place and in this space, nurtured by this congregation and the ways in which you've led also in this city. And so it's a privilege to be here this morning. There are lots of ways in the midst of the pandemic that we've shifted what it is that we do and how we're about. I love the old story of the newcomer to church who was curious about all the things that were happening. With each thing that occurred, the lighting of the candles, the standing up and the sitting down, they'd ask their friends, so, what does that mean? And they would tell them, well, what does that mean? The person would tell them, what happens when the choir stands? What does that mean? Well, it just means this. So the time came for the sermon, and the preacher took his watch off and put it on the stand. It's almost ritualistic, and the person said to so what does that mean? And the friend looked at him and said, unfortunately, nothing. Hopefully, I'll try to pay attention to time a bit today. So here we are, at the end of a process for you. And sometimes we get to those graduation moments and we say to ourselves, we're done. Am I cutting out here? God, I hate these mics. There we go. We get to these graduation moments and we have this sense somehow that we're completed. The work is done. But as often is said to students when they are graduating from high school, this is but one marker. Like all of those moments when we arrive, it is but a marker in our journey. We know that there is more that needs to be done, more that needs to happen. I know for us at Broadview, we're constantly having to remind ourselves of where is the diversity on our boards, on our committees, on the things that we're appointing to in our program. And so to become an affirmed congregation means that it's one lens by which we view the world. This is not staying with me, is it? Right. I like to wander, but I guess I'm going to have to use this mic here. There we go. Can I take this off then? All right. It becomes one lens by which we do the work that we do. And so it is through those lenses that we start to take stock of our world. But it's also part of the way in which we discern what is being seen and not seen. And so if I could give a title to my message today, it would be, What is Seen and Not Seen? And it's the reason I chose the scripture passage that I did this day. Typically, what's seen in this passage is the faithfulness of the Roman soldier, the officer who is able to command and has such great faith in Jesus that he's able to ask Jesus to heal. That's typically what's seen in the text. But I want to talk today about what's not seen in this text. I want us to think a little bit about the relationship between the Roman officer and the servant. I want us to think for a minute about the ways in which typically those hierarchies of relationships worked and what would have been a context here. I want us to think about the ways of what's missing in the story and for us to begin to bring a questioning mind to those things. The Roman officer is really quite clear that he doesn't want Jesus in his home. It's couched in all sorts of noble aspirations of not wanting to bother Jesus. But I wonder if there are some other reasons. You may remember at the beginning of many of these journeys for folks who are part of the LGBTQ community, that there were questions often raised when people came into their home and saw one bed or one bedroom for two people who were supposedly roommates. I think such is true of this story as well. The Roman officer and the servant are not servant and officer. They're partners. And having Jesus and the rest of the community in the home would raise questions that the Roman officer doesn't want raised. What's seen and what's not seen. Behind the bravado of the power and the authority that this Roman officer has is couched this concern and care. If we think about it, the hierarchy between officer, soldiers, and servant or slaves would have been marked. And so a servant or a slave would have been expendable. So what? They get sick, they die, get another one. Doesn't matter. They're not really human beings. They're simply a servant. So for a Roman officer to have this much care and concern for a servant tells us there's something else going on here. What is seen and what is not seen. That becomes the question for us as we make this journey to become a rainbow-inclusive society, community, and church. To be aware of the ways in which people desire to be seen, understood, embraced, and loved for who they are. I cannot believe that Jesus didn't know those things. And yet, without judgment at all, Jesus, as is characteristic of his way of being in the world, simply loves and heals. Without question, without condition, Jesus simply offers healing and praises the Roman officer for the great faith that he has. Underlying, Jesus also praises the officer for the great love that he has, that transcends orientation, that transcends class, that transcends all sorts of things that are seen and unseen in this story. My whole life in ministry in the United Church has been consumed with the question of sex, orientation, inclusion, and ministry. I was commissioned into the ministry in 1987, the year before the great schism of '88. But from the very earliest ages that I remember being involved in church and confirmation, the questions that the United Church was asking were always at the forefront. In 1978, when the church released its first report, male and female, an inclusion kind of question, I remember the stirring, the anxiety, the distress, and the conversations around in the coffee time. I was only 15 at the time, in my own psychosexual development stages, but nonetheless very aware that questions were being asked that were seen as inappropriate for church. Inappropriate for church. I remember that phrase being murmured around. And I think back to the ways in which we've treated issues around sexuality. I think back to my grandmother, who in 1941 gave birth to her first set of children, twins. Her husband was off fighting the war, and she was back living with her own family, and a distant cousin was also living with them in the front porch. The cousin had 2 children of her own and was about 15 years older than my grandmother was, and she was a midwife. And yet, as my grandmother went into this experience of childbirth, she had no preparation. She knew nothing of what to expect, despite the fact that there was a midwife living in the home. And when the doctor said to her, "Mrs. Day, you have to help. You've got to push," she had no idea what that meant. She wanted to help, but she didn't know what that meant. The conversations about sex and sexuality were so hidden that even to the place of giving birth, it was seen as improper. So as we fast forward through to 1978 and the reports that came after that, in those days, the United Church General Council met every second year. In 84 and 86, there were subsequent reports that now started to push at some of those issues. Were we going to be a church where persons who are both gay and straight would be acceptable? The debates raged hard. And I remember coming here to Victoria from Alberta, where I was living, to be a part of that General Council in 1988. And I remember the great bravery of those many who stood on the floor, knowing that their congregations back home would reject them and their perspectives, having been changed by the movement of the Spirit and of the conversations and debates that were held on the floor. I'm sure that if a vote had been taken immediately upon arrival, that motion in 1988, that all persons, regardless of sexual orientation, are eligible to be or become members of the order of ministry, would have failed resoundingly. But by the grace and the power of the Spirit through that debate, and particularly from the courage of folks who came out in the middle of that General Council, for whom their colleagues and their congregations had no idea what is seen and unseen. They lived their lives, but they lived it under the shadow of secrecy and of deceit, feeling they couldn't be who they were. And I remember with tears streaming down my face, watching as one colleague who I knew quite well, that was in a small rural charge, nearing the end of her ministry time in her 60s, her name was Gwen, came out on the floor. And I knew that she would not be able to go back to her town, to her home, or to her ministry. And that the chances of her finding another place to be in ministry at that moment could be next to impossible. People like Tim Stevenson, who pushed so hard and were ordained, found themselves struggling to find a pulpit that would accept them. And so it was a big step. And there was great courage in this denomination to make and move that direction. So here we are, some almost 35 years later, finding denominations around us still struggling with that same question. And so we should be proud. And yet in 1988, there was still this dichotomy. You were either gay or you were straight. And anything in between we didn't really want to talk about. And while it was in some of the initial reports, we got rid of all of that because we were mostly concerned that folks who were gay would echo what was the heteronormative ideology. But thankfully, the queer voices amongst us kept pushing to say, no, this is not about us conforming to your model of what's acceptable. It's about you beginning to hear the spectrum and the way in which the spectrum is broad and rainbow and full of many things. And so it is at this point in our history we've begun to understand, and I was delighted to see the gender gingerbread person up there for you, because we've begun to understand about things seen and unseen are what is important for us to begin to talk about. And like the centurion's servant, there are so many things that we often don't know about each other or sometimes even ourselves. And that there are so many spectrums for us when it comes to sexuality. Whether it be our gender spectrum, our orientation spectrum, our gender expression spectrum, our attraction spectrum, our romance spectrum. There are many. And the voices of those who are asking to be seen are finding the courage to speak, both inside the LGBTQIA2S+ movement, as well as those outside of it. There is as much turmoil at times within of those asking to be seen and their expressions honored, as there is from those of us on the outside. I had a conversation with one of the church elders in my congregation a week ago, who said, every time I turn around, there are more letters in this, and I can't keep track of it all. And I think it's too much for people to ask of us. And I said to her, because she was also complaining about the need to talk about pronouns. And I said to her, it's about those around you feeling seen for who they are, for being loved for who they are, for being embraced for who they are, created in the image of God. And so our task doesn't end this Sunday. Our task is but the beginning, for us to look around about what is seen and what is unseen, and to make space and room for the unseen to be vocalized, to be celebrated, and to be acknowledged. Thanks be to God as we make this journey together. Amen.